You never expect the thing that anchors you to the world to vanish in a single night. 1 second the tractor's silhouette is there against the porch light. The next your barn is a hunched shadow, and the air tastes like old rope and hammered metal, and you stand in the driveway with ash on your boots wondering how to put a life back together when everything you used to call normal is gone. My name is Eli Mercer, and that night lightning, dry corn, a barn that was more bones than would everything that felt steady about my place in the neighborhood broke loose. And by the time the fire trucks left and the sirens faded, I had an extra problem waiting at town hall. A room full of people who should have been neighbors, and one woman who thought my grief was a punchline. So listen, I'm going to tell you what happened, step by step, the way I remember it, because the stitches of the story are the only proof I've got that none of this was an accident, that whatever cruelty we saw was deliberate, and that paperwork and stubbornness can, sometimes, be more dangerous than a match. This is a story about land and memory and a small, slow-burning war between a man who wanted to rebuild and an association that thought property lines were just suggestions. I grew up on that land. My grandfather bought it in the 60s. There's a foundation stone by the eastern fence with his initials on it you could still see before the fire. It was never much a workhouse, a few acres of corn, a stand of maples that turned like a painter's palette in October, but it was ours, and when my wife left a little piece of her handwriting on a cedar bench by the creek, it felt permanent. Then the lightning hit, the barn went up, the pumps failed, and the next week I went looking for help. That's when I learned the hardest lesson about neighbors. Sometimes they see you at your most vulnerable, and they either step forward or they step in. Stonebridge Heights, that new development with the manicured lawns and solar panels that glinted like promises, sits on a low ridge that dips toward my property. The clubhouse had wood paneling, a chandelier that couldn't have been cheaper than a year of my crop, and every plastic sign in their yard read clean and certain. Community standards, rules, pride. The woman who ran their meetings called herself the president, Marla Hensley. She wore her hair like an exclamation point and a blazer that meant business. When I walked into their monthly meeting 2 weeks after the fire, driven more by stubbornness than any procedural right, I thought maybe someone might offer a generator, a hand, a prayer. Instead, Marla pointed, laughed, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, maybe the land finally took back what it was owed. The whispering was the worst, like a gallery turning its head to watch a car accident you couldn't stop. That insult lodged in my chest. I stammered through a reply, something about family history, about a deed that my grandfather kept in a tin box, and they clapped as if I was a sideshow. I left cold, and that night I started digging. Because when someone mocks you for losing everything, either you break or you fight. I chose fight. I called my brother, Cole, who practices real estate law out of the next county. He answered on the first ring like he always did, measured, a little flat in the voice when he knew something might get messy. Eli, calm down, he said. Start with the deed. So I did. The deed was that old stamped sheet you keep in a drawer, ink faded, county clerk's seal still legible. I ran my fingers over the legal description, meets and bounds, a line here, a bearing there. It sounded like gibberish if you were used to modern maps, but to a man like Cole, it was a map in words. He said, let me overlay this on a modern plat. Don't tell anyone yet. We hired Diego Ramos, a surveyor with cussed patience and a drone that smelled of new batteries and possibility. Diego flew the ridge and the field, stitched our old deed to a fresh GPS overlay. And when he showed me the first comparison on his laptop, my stomach turned like during a tractor roll. 7 homes from Stonebridge Heights, whole households, the carved porches and those neat solar arrays, sat half on what the county had always recorded as my land. Not a little sliver of chunk. The red line on his screen crossed sidewalks. It cut through a poplar grove. It sat where my grandfather planted corn. Diego's voice was low. He said, that doesn't just happen. Once you see a boundary with your own eyes on a screen, something shifts. You can't look at property the same way again. People think land is a thing treated by fences and surveys, but it's a story, layers of documents, human errors, intentional choices. We started pulling records. Jason, the title clerk who'd taken an extra liking to me when I paid his wife to fix my porch, found a plat from the 70s that showed an older, irregular line. There were emails in a county folder, scanned memos that hinted at a resurvey, a realignment, but the signatures were smudged or missing. Somewhere along the way, Stonebridge's footprint moved, and that moved right onto what my family had. We did the reasonable thing first. Cole drew up an offer, not angry, not dramatic, a polite letter outlining facts, a proposal for a fair transfer or compensation, a chance to avoid litigation. He mailed it certified to the HOA and their registered officers. We left a window open not because we were soft, but because courts take time, and I had crops rotting in a field and a house that needed more than a sympathy card. Some people fight to rob. I was fighting to replace a barn. So we tried talking. That's when the real twist came. Marla turned the conversation public, performative, theatrical. At a special HOA meeting, she stood at the podium like a preacher and read my brother's offer, as if it were extortion. We will not be bullied by a disgruntled farmer, she said. A few chairs clapped. The room hummed with that kind of anger that's born from not wanting to be wrong. She painted me as a speculator, a man trying to seize property from hardworking families. They called the sheriff about harassment, when all I'd done was ask for my boundary. What followed was something people only read about in small-town papers, a smear campaign. Someone left a flyer on my porch with a photograph of my burned barn and a headline that suggested arson. Someone posted in the community group that I'd been trying to sell the land to developers. I started getting calls from reporters who smelled a headline sensational, ugly. I kept my temper because if I lost it, I'd lose the jury I hoped to find later. Instead, Cole and I started layering defense, fire marshal reports, satellite images from the night of the storm, witness statements from people who'd seen the lightning hit. We needed everything to be clean because the HOA was trying to make me look criminal to deflect from the facts. Discovery is a strange thing like peeling the skin off an onion, and finding each layer smells more expensive than the last. In court we would later get access to HOA emails. They were sloppy, and that's what saved us. Marla had been meticulous in messaging the board, proud of maneuvers, smug about filings, certain she could herd votes. There was an internal memo where she'd written about clarifying the lot lines to make the development contiguous. In another email, she'd suggested fast-tracking permits before older plats could be pulled for review. That's the phrase Cole leaned on when he said, in a voice that made the judge listen, there was willful concealment. There was a moment, the midpoint, the hinge, when the judge signed a temporary restraining order that froze any new construction, any transfers, and demanded the HOA turn over records. It felt like my first real victory, the kind that makes your hands tremble with relief and fear both. Some neighbors reached out quietly after that order, a woman who brought over pie and left it on my porch, a man who'd waved at me every morning and whose son worked at a house I'd helped build once. Small apology notes that didn't say the word sorry, but carried it anyway. Power shifts slowly, like weather. But Marla was not finished. By then she had an army of lawyers, a carefully selected firm with a tone-deaf brochure, and a partner who smiled without moving his eyes. They pushed back hard in court and in the press. They insisted on procedural technicalities, on interpretations of bearings, on minutiae meant to drown us. I remember sitting in the gallery one morning while Cole cross-referenced an old surveyor's field note with a modern one, and feeling like we were engaged in a long game of chess where every piece had a paper trail. Court days are long and smell like coffee and dry mouth. Jason, my brother, who tended to carry a half-smile that never reached his eyes in court, walked the jury through maps like a storyteller. He called Diego up, who spoke in plain words about GPS, about how you can't just nudge a line to suit yourself without an amendment. He had the drone footage queued up, the overlays, the historic plats projected full size, so everyone could see the discrepancy in black and white. Then Cole did something I didn't expect. He read, aloud, a line from one of Marla's emails where she joked about consolidating lots before the clerk sleeps on it. The room shifted. People lean forward when they smell real intent. The antagonist in any story is never a cardboard villain. Marla had reasons, or at least motives, that made some sense to her: pride, control, a view of community that put aesthetics above history. When we finally sat across from each other in a hall before the judge, her words were sharp as broken glass. You expect us to tear down people's homes for a farmer's nostalgia? She demanded. You want to ruin lives over a scribble on a map? Her tone was hungry for audience sympathy. I could see in her the fear, loss of reputation, the possibility that everything she'd built socially and financially might be undone. Fear makes good people into poor strategists, and fear makes bad people loud. I didn't want to ruin lives. I wanted the truth, and if truth required remedy, then the remedy was the law. The judge, who had a patience like a weathered fence post, listened without flinching. Evidence was presented. Chain of title, tax assessments that conflicted, emails, sworn testimony from county clerks. Diego stood under oath and described the overlay process, the reliability of satellite timestamps. An older surveyor, retired but bound by duty, came in with a battered leather portfolio, and his hands shook when he handed over an original stamping. The courtroom had the electricity of a storm rolling in. Verdicts are strange. They are both a relief and the beginning of a new complication. The judge found that several of the Stonebridge Lot 7 in total did indeed encroach upon the Mercer property according to the original deeds and the most reliable surveys. The court found the HOA liable for trespass and negligence in record-keeping. It also found Marla negligent in her duties and recommended further review for potential civil penalties. There was applause in the gallery, small, quick, like birds taking flight, and a silence that felt like a held breath. Then came the practical part, remedies. The judge gave homeowners choices: purchase the land they were sitting on at fair market value, after appraisal, or accept the court-ordered transfer and face the prospect of moving. For some families the choice was shockingly simple. They had deep ties to their homes, the kids' schools, the morning route to the bakery. For others, the math didn't add up. 2 families opted to vacate. They left boxes in the yard and a car that slowed down as if blanketed by regret. Deputies oversaw orderly removals. It was official but not cinematic. Marla packed her blazer and a stack of plans. There was no dramatic shouting, no cinematic collapse, just the soft thud of a door closing on someone who had been certain she was untouchable. People asked me if I cheered when the evictions happened. I didn't. I stood on the porch and watched moving trucks go by like they were swallowing memories. It tasted of ashes and coffee. Justice, I learned, is messy. It fixes things and it breaks others. You have to decide which parts of life you can live with being broken. I chose to take back what was mine not because I wanted to punish, but because erasure is a dangerous thing. When land can be reconfigured by the loudest voices in a room, when memory can be rewritten by administrative convenience, what are the small places of comfort left for people who farm, who raise kids, who plant trees? After the verdict, I did what you might expect. I rebuilt. The barn came up in stages: foundations first, then beams, then the familiar crooked door we had always joked about. I kept one of the reclaimed houses as a workshop and leased 2 lots back to neighbors for a fair price, and I donated a wedge of land to a local conservation trust to protect the creek that fed the maples. Not because I wanted accolades, but because I wanted a way to thread community back together. A few never came. That was their choice. One scene I keep replaying is the last time I saw Marla before she moved out. She came by the property line with a small stack of box things, gloves on, a face like a mask. For a second I thought she might say something heartfelt or defiant. Instead she looked at the cedar bench by the creek, my wife's handwriting there, and she said, quietly, "I never understood why you held on to that." I said, "Because some things are worth keeping." She left without an answer. How do you reclaim dignity after you've been ridiculed for losing your barn? How do you show up for a neighbor whose life boiled down to nothing more than a news bit? The law untangles certain knots. It does not fix the slow erosion of trust. That's the work that comes after verdicts, the potlucks, the afternoon repairs, the kids who run across a yard and don't know the history. There were costs. Cole's practice took a hit because he leaned into a messy fight that had powerful people watching. Diego worked unpaid for weeks on additional surveys. I sold a portion of the reclaimed land to cover fees and to avoid dragging any more neighbors into ruin. But the real cost was different. It was nights lying awake, thinking of the people we displaced, wondering if we had erred in calibrating justice. You learn to live with that too. You learn that the right answer rarely feels like a clean blessing. It's more like a stubborn tool you use to carve a better piece out of a difficult puzzle. I tell you this because in every community there's a version of Stonebridge. There are people who organize and manage and enforce rules, sometimes fairly, sometimes jealously, and there are people who get left out in storms. Rules can protect, and rules can blind. If you're watching this and you live in a neighborhood association, do me a favor. Ask yourselves what you would do if it was your barn that burned, your mother's bench, your family history. Would you laugh, or would you look for the person under the ash? If there's a single lesson I took away, it's this. Documents matter, but so does persistence. Old plats and stamps and signatures can be contorted, but they are anchors if you're willing to read them and fight for what's on paper. You don't want to fight like this by rage. You win it by being methodical, by collecting witnesses, by making sure the story is in order and presented plainly. And you have to be ready for the fallout, for friends to flee, for some to call you greedy, for others to side with whoever seems less threatening at the moment. The HOA reorganized, with new leadership that promised transparency and meetings that are shorter and less theatrical. That's progress, I guess, but progress in small towns is a slow river, and sometimes the sediment of old things never quite clears. I'm not asking you to take my side. I want something else, conversation. Tell me what justice looks like to you. If you like this story, share it. If you want a deeper dive into the legal side, tell me and I'll break down the documents and the timeline in another video. Hit like if you felt the weight of it. Subscribe if you want more real stories, not polished scandals. Just the slow, complicated truth, and ring the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And if you've ever watched your life burn down and wondered what you would do, start with the deed, and then start with stubbornness, because sometimes that's all you get.